Does it matter if the United States Department of Defense defines the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as either Christian or not? There's been a lot of discussion over the last week over an evolving policy that the Department of Defense, and yes, I'm calling that until Congress changes it to the Department of War, that regards their religious affiliation classification system. Sean Parnell, the press secretary for the Department of Defense, put it this way in the announcement of the changes, quote, "The Office of the Secretary of War is announcing a significant change to the department's categorization of religious affiliation. In a long overdue move, we reduced the list from over 200 unmanageable categories to 31. With this move, we are returning to the original intent of collecting this data, to allow our chaplains and religious support personnel to provide the best spiritual care to our warfighters. This decrease in religious affiliation codes is not designed to make any claims of the legitimacy of any faith or religious belief, nor is it intended to provide a list of officially approved religions. Rather, it is designed to allow chaplains to quickly look at the religious composition of their units and determine how they structure resources to best provide for warfighters of all faith groups." So let's talk for a minute before we get into the Mormon component about what this change does and does not do. The classification has to do with things like personnel identification codes, the assignment of chaplains, as well as what goes on things like dog tags. Now, the numbers can be striking, dropping from over 200 to 31, but that can be a bit misleading because a majority of those religious affiliations that were dropped out were merely converged into broader categories. For instance, there were dozens of types of Baptists listed that are now listed as just Baptists. For example, see this chart will explains all these broader or more specific affiliations that were converged into larger ones. Perhaps most alarming, the most negative takeaways are those religious groups that were deleted entirely. Groups like the Unitarian Universalists, the Wiccans, the Deists, and even atheists, who all now have to be categorized as either no religion or other religion. And I do think it's a bit ironic, especially in the 250th year of America, where we're celebrating the founders, that many of those founders were affiliated with a religious identity that is now not even recognized by the Department of Defense. But that's a topic for another day. The biggest attention, of course, that came from these changes was how the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints fit in. While the LDS faith survived and is one of the 31 identities in the list, you'll note that among most of those 20 Christian identities, it has Christian next to them, and it did not for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This, of course, was a massive blow to Latter-day Saints, who have done a lot of work to try to emphasize their Christian affiliation, putting an emphasis on the name, not using Mormon, adopting the Christus as the church logo, emphasizing the larger font of Jesus Christ when putting out their title. And among those most outraged, of course, were the senators from Utah, Mike Lee and John Curtis. Mike Lee, of course, being the most active ex-users, and he railed against the administration for this, showing that there is some outrage behind it, and it's not just a clerical issue because the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is too long, though it is certainly that. Now, this policy has since been revised a Monday of this week. They removed the Christian label from these different 20 categories so that they are all now just listed as Baptist, Methodist, or whatnot, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So notably, it's not saying Mormons are Christian now as a result of pushback from Mike Lee and John Curtis. Instead, it's just not saying that Mormons aren't Christian, which I think is a key distinction that is getting lost in the coverage of these changes. But regardless of the seesaw moving back and forth, I think this episode can tell us a lot about a much longer history of this tension between evangelicals and Mormons and the place of the Christian label in modern politics. And that's what I want to dive into here. And if you stick around to the very end of the video, I'll offer what I think are the 5 most important lessons from this tumultuous week. First, it'd be good to remind ourselves of the stakes at play here, that the definition of Christianity, while it might seem obvious to those who belong to one identity or another or are viewing from the outside, has been a lot more eclectic and evolving over the years than you might assume. There is no universally approved definition of Christianity. Of course, there are many Christians who would say, well, you need to believe in a set of creeds in order to be defined as a Christian, or you have to accept certain baptisms to be defined as a Christian. Those are theological arguments. Those reflect certain assumptions that are not shared across all these different groups. Scholars of religious studies will emphasize that the term Christianity is as much of a cultural construct as it is a theological dogma, which means as the term Christian remains significant because it comes with privileges and obligations and perks, especially in the American nation that many believe is a Christian country. It means it's always hotly contested. And if you look at those groups on the margins like the Mormons, it helps us see those changing boundary lines. And the church has done a lot to try to address this. The Russell M. Nelson push to retire the Mormon nickname, the adoption of the Christus as the logo, the emphasis that we are Bible-based Christians. And there seemed to be an assumption in that push that as long as we are consistent in that messaging, as long as we emphasize our attachment to Christ, that others are going to recognize that or acknowledge our position, which misunderstands the history of American religion, in which these titles, these labels, are not merely bestowed upon those who ask for them, but they are often contested. And this long history of evangelicalism is not just subverted due to a very successful PR move, for instance. And then we need to talk about the stakes of what's going on for the Department of Defense. That why do they have these religious affiliations anyway? Well, this goes back to a fascinating history. Before World War I, the only religious affiliations the War Department back then used were Protestant or Catholic, basically. And it's in the ensuing century that the government has had to get into the religious identification game because the troops are often as diverse in background as the U.S. public writ large. And so they want to accommodate that to be a successful fighting force, which has often meant a broader acceptance of pluralism. If you're interested in that story, by the way, Ronit Stahl has a wonderful book titled Enlisting Faith, How the Military Chaplaincy Shaped Religion and State in Modern America, which shows the politics behind what might seem like simple solutions like what is a religion, what is a denomination, and how do we recognize it. The pains of becoming a much more pluralist nation, which hits the ground with the chaplaincy issue of who are we going to recognize. And Mormons had to fight hard for that designation amidst a broader cultural movement that obviously is still being shaped. By the way, before I go much further, just a reminder that if you enjoy this type of historical content, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. I try to do 3 videos a week, a deep dive on topics on Monday, a connection of past and present on Wednesday, and a pulling back of the historical craft on Friday. And if you really enjoyed the content and if you want to give back, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have given back, you can become a member of the channel, where for a very nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get icons next to your name when you leave comments, and most importantly, you can feel good about supporting public-facing rigorous scholarship. I also encourage you to subscribe to my free kit newsletter, where I send out what they call blasts every other week or so with links, updates, and announcements. And you can also follow me on my social media platforms, where I provide supplemental material to the videos you watch here. But speaking of which, let's get back to today's video and the politics of the Christian identity. You don't have to be much of a historian to know that evangelicals have long been skeptical of Mormons. They see them as unchristian, worshiping a different Christ in addition to the Bible, having a different type of priesthood authority, that they are heretics. And that existed, of course, for a long time. But the perpetuation and evolution of that distrust faced a massive crossroads in American history in the 1970s and 1980s, when there were 2 potential trajectories that evangelicals, especially those who are pushing a a white Christian nationalist idea, wondering whether we should work with or against the Mormons, they could have taken, meaning two different roads. And now I want to emphasize that these two roads are not mutually exclusive. You can also often find them at the same time and sometimes even in the same person. It's a matter of turning up the dial on one and turning down the dial on the other. And that's the back and forth tension that we've seen in the last few decades and were embodied in this fight over the Christian label with the Department of Defense last week. One of these potential trajectories is embodied in Ed Decker, an anti-cult, anti-Mormon evangelical pastor who insisted on calling out these non-Christian groups and defining the boundaries of a Christian nation that includes only true Christians. He's the one behind the famous God Makers documentary and book and sequels that was seen by hundreds of thousands of evangelicals in the 1980s. In many ways, a continuation of the long-held skepticism that evangelicals held toward Mormons, maintaining a theological purity. But the other potential trajectory is what you see embodied in Jerry Falwell, the famous minister who led the Coalition of the Moral Majority, part of the religious right movement that argued that if we want to be a cultural power, if we want to push back on moral progressivism and democratic politics, we need to set aside our theological squabbles, no longer prioritize the policies, the theological boundaries that kept the Mormons away from us, and instead emphasize these partisan agreements arranged around social issues like gender and race in particular. And Mormons were able to prove their worth to this rising religious right coalition through their participation in the anti-ERA crusades and abortion, and then, of course, same-sex marriage later on. And at least for a while, the Jerry Falwell model seemed to work. We saw the culmination of this in Mitt Romney a couple decades later. I've done videos on all of these topics, by the way, so you can go back if you want to see a deeper analysis. But when Mitt Romney ran for his second time in 2012, you see more people adopting the Jerry Falwell pragmatic approach, perhaps none more prominently than Robert Jeffress, the Baptist minister in Dallas, who said that while Mormonism might be a theological cult, it's not a sociological cult, which means that we should be able to work with them, seeing them as fellow Christians fighting against the progressive corrosions in the American nation. And yet that alliance was always skin deep, and it could at any moment be overturned, which is why we are seeing it tested once again in the recent year. And I think we need to unpack the meaning of that. Now, as I've said before, there has been a rise in anti-Mormon sentiment in America writ large recently, but especially among evangelicals. And we see these in a variety of different forms. Sometimes it's more of the anti-institutional variety that is calling out the church as a deep state and part of this global cabal. You see this with Candace Owens and the ex-Mormon Tim Ballard. Others, it's based more on an old school theological Bible bash like Mark Driscoll, who said that the Mormons were demonic and the guy who killed Charlie Kirk was poisoned by the Mormon mind. And yet others are of the more traditional evangelical anti-religious heresy movement, like Ed Decker. We see this most recently as Turning Points USA, the former Charlie Kirk movement, featuring a number of very prominent anti-Mormon evangelical pastors coming on and saying that we cannot get too comfortable with this heresy becoming normalized in the United States. And I'm going to talk about one of the most prominent people who has a direct connection to the Department of Defense to show to kind of connect this entire full circle. I think it's important to note, however, that this movement by white evangelicals to alienate or emphasize the distinctions between them and Mormons is unnecessary. It's unwise, and in the end, it's probably unsustainable because white evangelicals are taking up a decreasing portion of the American body, meaning that there are fewer white evangelicals now than there were a decade ago, and a decade ago it was fewer than a decade before that, which means they need that type of friendship and alliance. And so it's not smart politics to start alienating them, which is why it's so interesting that they are. But I think they are because it's coming from a point of anxiety, that they worry that Latter-day Saints have become too accepted, and that they feel a sense of cultural power. I think over the last 2 years, the second Trump presidency is a sign of this white Christian nationalism ascendant, where they thought that they had lost the demographic and ideological game in America. But now they feel much more power, which means they sense that they can afford to cut off previous pragmatic alliances. And of course, a person who I think embodies this the most is Pete Hegseth's own pastor, Douglas Wilson. He leads Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho. He's unapologetically Christian nationalist, blending the anti-woke, anti-Marxist politics with his evangelical identity. He's also a neo-Confederate with very, I would say, discussing views on race and the history of slavery, but that's a topic of another video. But we see the blending of these political lenses with doctrinal boundaries, and why that idea. Now, I'm not saying that he wrote this new code for the Department of Defense, but I think those ideas are emblematic of the broader movement that led us to that we are accepting Mormons, but we are not going to normalize them, and we are not going to accept them within the Christian fold. And so while they came out and revised their categories and removed the Christian title from the 20 previously Christian titles, so now the Latter-day Saints are just the same as the others, which, remember, does not mean that they're saying the Mormons are Christian. They're just not saying the Mormons aren't Christian. I think it fits into this back and forth of how pragmatic do we have to be, and when are we in a position of power to actually push back. And I think that this effort, this change, is just the latest iteration of this, which brings me to what I see the 5 major takeaway lessons. All right, so my 5 main takeaway lessons after this back and forth of the Department of Defense saying the Mormons aren't Christian to now just saying that, okay, we're not going to prioritize that. First is the lingering issues of evangelicals and Mormonism, that this pragmatic alliance is not deep, it's not systematic, and it's not coherent. It can go away. It's ephemeral. It can disappear. That the LDS were able to gain a retraction in this case, but once again, it feels like a temporary victory, not a long-term gain. That alliance is always pragmatic, meaning that once that pragmatism is no longer needed or seen as needed, it can go away. Evangelicals, in other words, are only reluctantly working with Mormons, that they're still not willing to grant Mormons a Christian label, but they're just not going to make it a thing right now. We're not going to emphasize this. Second main point, the increasing political and cultural capital that Mormons have in the public sphere. The fact that Mike Lee and John Curtis were able to get Pete Hegseth and the White House to step back on this, I think is crucial. That's something that Mormons have not always been able to do in American history, as recently as a couple of generations ago. So I think it shows that Mormons do have a place on the public stage in which they can push back, in part due to this alliance they've made with the religious right. I will note that when Mike Lee said that he'd spoken with Donald Trump about this, I would love to watch the video of Donald Trump trying to comprehend and explain the theological nuances of what is considered Christian, especially if he can start talking about the Nicene Creed. That would just be first-rate television. Third main point. As I mentioned before, I think evangelicals are being reminded that alienating Mormons or not prioritizing that relationship is unnecessary, it's unwise, and it's unsustainable. They're not in a position of power to alienate friends. And so that's why, in the end, they had to back down. That pragmatic alliance was too important in this era. But 4, this shows that the evangelical leaders are often getting a bit desperate, that these are desperate acts from a place of anxiety rather than a calculated act from strength. Often we see these appeals to certainty, to want to define who belongs and who doesn't, not at a point where all of that is determined, but at a point where you want to make it determined. This is an aspirational move, not a descriptive move, a prescriptive motion to define Christianity that they recognize they are not able to control as much as before. And fifth, and finally, the continued significance of the Christian label while still recognizing the malleability of its boundaries. Again, there's no central power or universally agreed upon definition for Christianity. Creeds are not universal. Baptisms are not shared across all these different faiths. And yet that term brings immense privileges, which is why the LDS Church has fought so hard for it, not just because of a theological idea that we want to be seen as Christians because we worship Jesus Christ, which I grant is how a lot of LDS leaders think, but also because there's a lot of cultural and political capital that comes from this. And it's also a reminder that no matter how much you say you're Christian, it's still going to be defined on these cultural power structures that are beyond their control. You can't just put on a new logo, emphasize the Christian name, distance yourself from the Mormon nickname, and expect everyone else to go along. Culture, and especially American Christianity, American religion, is far more complicated than that. And I think Latter-day Saints are continually having to learn that lesson. I'm recording this video on Monday afternoon. It's just been a couple hours since they changed those religious affiliation categorizations. It may change again by the time this video posts Wednesday morning, so give me some grace if that happens. But regardless of the end result, I think this fascinating back and forth is another reminder of how we are shaped by history. These terms are both imminently malleable, but also deeply significant. And those things exist in common. It's just the latest example of a much longer existing tension. Where do Mormons find a place in white Christian nationalism? What do they have to do to get acceptance? And how firm is that acceptance? How ephemeral is it? How can it go away? I think we saw a moment of that. That's why I think Mike Lee was so upset, because in a way they have done so much to earn a place at the white Christian nationalist table that it's almost a betrayal when they feel like they lost that acceptance. But again, that's the politics. And this is beyond just, I can't believe the leopards eating people's faces party are now eating my face. This goes into a long-standing political tradition of defining Christianity and all the privileges that come with it. And the Mormons attempt to enter that party, and the evangelicals not being too happy about it and only accepting them on their terms, even if that acceptance is only skin deep and it can go away at any moment. I hope this video made sense. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it added something to the discourse. If so, hit the like button, share with others so we can broaden the conversation, and add your thoughts in the comments too. History has never been more relevant than it is today because it can give us a longer context to understand these developments that might seem a bit inexplicable in the moment, but in the longer frame of things, seems quite common.